Okay, thank you again. And just like yesterday, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I think we have plenty of time to discuss and make any clarifications that may be needed. So I'll talk about non-interactive zero knowledge for every language in NP based on the learning with errors problem that we've heard so much about these couple of days. And this is based on a work with Sina, my PhD student, or former PhD student now, and relatively recent. So this was discovered earlier in the year, at the beginning of the year, and now it's the end of the year, but it's been a short time since this work came out. So the topic for the talk is zero knowledge, which was introduced by Goldwasser, Macaulay, and Rakov in 1985. And in zero knowledge, it's an interactive protocol for a particular language L. So we have a language L that we're interested in, and for zero knowledge, we have a prover who might be unbounded or may have a witness, and it wants to convince a skeptical verifier that some string is in the language, but revealing nothing more than that. So it kind of wants to convince the verifier that X is a member of the language L, but reveal nothing more. And it's useful to have in mind an example protocol that's zero knowledge. And one of the earliest such protocols is this so-called cut and choose protocol for the graph isomorphism language. So in graph isomorphism, an instance of the language is two graphs, G0 and G1. And the claim is that the graphs are isomorphic. So the prover wants to convince the verifier that G0 is isomorphic to G1. Now it's very easy to prove such a fact. Just demonstrate an isomorphism between the two graphs, and then the verifier can check that it is an isomorphism. But that doesn't appear to be zero knowledge. That's telling the verifier not only that the graphs are isomorphic, but it's also giving the verifier, the witness, or giving an isomorphism between the graphs, which the verifier may not be able to produce on its own. So instead, we'll have a different kind of protocol here, and it will be zero knowledge. It will tell the verifier nothing more than the fact that the graphs are isomorphic. So here we have the prover has the two graphs, and let's suppose that the prover also has an isomorphism between the two graphs. So G0 is pi of G1. And now the prover will choose a random permutation of one of the graphs, let's say G0. It doesn't matter which. So he chooses a random permutation row of G0 and sends that permuted graph to the verifier. And now the verifier issues the prover a challenge. And the challenge is just a bit, 0 or 1, chosen at random. And basically this challenge means that the prover is asking, the verifier is asking or challenging the prover to show that H is isomorphic to G sub B. So it's saying, okay, prover, you told me H, now I challenge you, show me that H is isomorphic to graph 0, for example, or graph 1. And the prover will answer the challenge, as you might expect. So it just demonstrates an isomorphism between H and G0 or G1, whichever one was requested. So for example, if the verifier requests G0, then we just send row, right? And the permutation row connects G0 to H. If the verifier requests 1, or an isomorphism between H and G1, we can present that as well. We just compose row with pi, right? So pi of G1 gives us G0, and then row of that gives us H. So this will always be a permutation connecting H to the desired graph, and the verifier does indeed check that sigma, the permutation, does so. Okay, and what's interesting is that this is zero knowledge. Well, first of all, it's complete. So if the graphs are isomorphic, then P will always be able to convince the verifier by answering the challenge correctly. It's also sound, and the soundness is interesting. If the graphs were not isomorphic, so the prover's lying or trying to prove a false statement, then no matter what graph is sent in the first message here, that graph can be isomorphic to at most one of the two graphs. Right? It could be isomorphic to G0 or to G1, but not both, because G0 and G1 are not isomorphic to each other. And so when the verifier makes its random challenge, there's a 1/2 chance that the prover is stuck, that it cannot demonstrate a isomorphism between H and the requested graph. So no matter what a cheating prover does, as soon as it sends its first message, the verifier has a 1/2 chance of catching the prover in a lie, right? Of making a request or a challenge that the prover simply cannot answer. And so the verifier will only be fooled with probability at most 1/2, or that, said another way, the verifier will catch the prover in this lie with probability at least 1/2. So those are the completeness and soundness properties of this protocol. And then the third property is the zero knowledge, which is that we can actually simulate the verifier's view. So everything that the verifier sees in this protocol can be simulated without talking to a prover at all. And that's the essence of the zero knowledge property. Okay, so I won't define it formally, but that's the notion of the zero knowledge property, that whatever the verifier sees when talking to the prover could actually be produced without talking to the prover in the first place. One thing I would also like to mention about the soundness is that, well, when the graphs are non-isomorphic, a cheating prover convinces the verifier with maybe 1/2 probability, which is probably too high, right? In reality, you wouldn't want to risk your life or your cryptographic keys or anything significant on such a high probability. But we can reduce that 1/2 probability exponentially by just running this protocol in parallel many times. Okay, so instead, we can run this protocol, let's say 100 times or 200 times, either in parallel or one after the other, and then the prover will only be able to cheat the verifier with like a 1 in to the 100 probability, which is very, very tiny. Okay, so those are the three properties of this protocol that we like to focus on. And that's for a particular language, though, the graph isomorphism language. So now the natural question comes up is, which languages have zero knowledge proofs? And it was shown very early in 1986, just a year after zero knowledge was introduced, that if one-way functions exist, then every language in NP has a zero knowledge proof. And so we can use one-way functions to construct commitment schemes, and with commitment schemes, you can give a zero knowledge proof for the three-colorability problem, for example. And three-colorability is NP-complete, so with a protocol for three-colorability, you get a protocol for any NP language. And moreover, this can be swapped to be you could either have a zero knowledge proof, or you could give a zero knowledge argument with statistical zero knowledge. That was shown much later, 20 years later, by these authors. So there are many applications to zero knowledge for arbitrary NP languages. You can do identification schemes. It's used centrally in secure computation protocols, and any other time that you would like to force a party to prove that it is acting honestly, for example. So a party can present some messages as part of a protocol, and to prove that it is not misbehaving, it can prove in zero knowledge that it is acting according to a specified protocol. So it's a very important object to have, and has countless applications. So one protocol that we will focus on today traces back to Figo, Lapido, and Shamir with a couple of small modifications that I'll show here. But this is a nice protocol for Hamiltonian cycle, which is a NP-complete problem. So since we have a protocol for this NP-complete problem, we have a protocol for all NP languages. And the particular notion of the particular protocol for Hamiltonian cycle will be important for what we do later. So here we have a graph G, which is claimed to have a Hamiltonian cycle, and the prover knows that such a cycle. And the verifier just has a graph G. So the first thing that the prover will do, similarly to before with graph ISO, is to choose a random permutation of the graph G, call that H again. But instead of sending H to the verifier, we will actually send a commitment to H. Okay, so in particular, we will commit to every edge or non-edge of the graph. So for every pair of vertices i and j, we will commit to the bit hij, which indicates whether there is an edge between vertex I and j in the graph H. And then we will also commit to the permutation row itself. Okay, so we just send all these commitments to the verifier. And this basically binds the prover to the graph H, but without revealing H to the verifier. The verifier, similarly as before, just chooses a random bit as a challenge, but the meaning of this bit will be quite different. So in the case where the challenge is 0, the verifier is essentially asking the prover to open all of these commitments. Okay, so when b is 0, the prover is supposed to open all these commitments and to show that there is a graph H inside these commitments, which is isomorphic to G. Okay, so by opening all of these commitments, the prover can then tell the verifier what H is and what the permutation was, and the verifier checks that indeed H was the committed permutation of G. When B is 1, so when the challenge bit is 1, we do something completely different. The prover will instead open up all of these edge commitments corresponding to the cycle in G, but the permuted cycle. So we look at the permuted cycle, which tells us the edges through H that form a Hamiltonian cycle. And we open up all of those committed edges, but no more. And the verifier checks that these commitments are correctly opened and that they form a cycle through the graph H. Well, we don't see the entire graph H, we just see some of its edges, the ones that were opened up in the commitments. But we can verify that those edges form a cycle and that they all are indeed edges in the committed graph. Okay. So the reason why this is, it's clear that this is complete. If the graph does have a cycle, the prover can always complete all these steps and convince the verifier. It's also sound because at the beginning here, the prover is committing to a graph. And it's either committing to a graph which is isomorphic to G or is not isomorphic to G. So if it commits to a graph which is not isomorphic to G, then the prover will not be able to answer this challenge here. So if it cheats by committing to a bad graph, then it will get caught when the challenge is 0. If it commits to a good graph, a graph which is isomorphic to G, and G does not have a Hamiltonian cycle, then it will not be able to answer this kind of challenge. Because if the graph here is isomorphic to G, there is no Hamiltonian cycle in it, and therefore you cannot find any cycle to open these commitments to. So that's why it's complete and sound, and the zero knowledge is a bit harder to argue, but essentially these commitments hide the graph, and we can simulate a view by choosing the challenge in advance and then figuring out what to commit to. So the zero knowledge is not quite as easy to see in this case, but it does work. Okay, so any questions about this Hamiltonian sentence? Right, why do we need this commitment to the isomorphism row? You're right, well, it depends on what the prover provides here. So yeah, this is not exactly the Feige-Lapidoshimir protocol. I've changed it a slight bit for reasons that will become clear later on in the talk. But you do have to show that, in this case, you do have to show that H is isomorphic to G. The verifier does not know how to check that itself. The prover actually has to supply the isomorphism. So, you could send the isomorphism separately here without committing to it originally. That is correct, but for reasons that we'll see later on, we will want to have this. Yeah, good question. Okay. Any other question about this protocol? Okay, so all of this is using interaction. So the prover and the verifier are sending messages back and forth to each other. But in many cases, interaction is not always possible. The two parties may not be online at the same time, or you might want to store a proof for later use, and so you can't always have interaction. And so Blum, DeSantis, McCauley, and Persiano asked, what if we change the picture here to just have the prover send a single proof string pi to the verifier, which the verifier either accepts or rejects. So there's no back and forth between the two parties. Well, it's not too difficult to show, it's a bit of an exercise to show that in this non-interactive model, the languages that we can prove in this model, which are denoted NIZK, so the set of such languages, is limited to languages that we can decide on our own, trivially. So there's really nothing that you can prove in this model that the verifier can't just decide on its own. So there's no real, the proof is not really adding anything that the verifier can, you don't need proof, basically. The verifier can just decide on its own. So this is not very interesting. However, if we change the model a little bit to allow some kind of setup, and that setup is often modeled as a publicly available random string or a reference string, then we can do some very interesting things. So the model is that there's some setup at the beginning where a random string is chosen and made available to all of the parties, both the prover and the verifier. And so you might imagine that this trusted random string is the result of some, maybe it's some lottery numbers or something like that, or you look at sunspots or some kind of natural phenomenon that occurs and you measure that and you use that as a source of randomness, which is coming from a trustworthy source, a trustworthy place. And then with that random string, the prover and the verifier can then execute this protocol. Another possibility is that we have what's called a reference string, where the reference string may not be uniformly random. It may be, has to be selected by a trusted party that runs an algorithm and then outputs a string that may have some structure to it, rather than being completely random. That's a slightly different model where you have to have somebody you trust to generate that string. But in either case, it is possible now to get non-trivial, non-interactive zero-knowledge protocols. In fact, we can prove any language in NP in this non-interactive zero-knowledge model under various complexity assumptions. So initially it was shown that if you have, under the quadratic residuosity assumption or trapdoor permutations more generally, then you can get you can get NIZK for any NP language. And then that, another completely different method was shown by Graf, Ostrovsky, and Sahai in 2006 using pairings. And then by Sahai and Waters in 2014 using the new technology of obfuscation. So all of these assumptions are relatively ad hoc, right? They're kind of structured algebraic assumptions. And none of them is really, secure under quantum attacks, except maybe obfuscation. We don't know, kind of don't know the status of that. But in any case, there are many applications of NIZK. So signatures, there's a generic transformation which gives you digital signatures, actively secure encryption. These are used all over in cryptocurrencies nowadays, and many other places. So we like to have non-interactive zero-knowledge proofs. But unfortunately, going back at least to 2007, 2008, we did not have any post-quantum foundation for non-interactive zero-knowledge. In particular, we didn't know how to do it based on lattices or LWE or any other plausible lattice assumption. And this question tormented me and many others for a long time, 12 or more years. We just could not make any real meaningful progress on it. And it seemed very strange because we had NIZK based on all of these kind of bread and butter assumptions in cryptography for a long time, back to the 80s, but we can't do, we could do all these amazing things with lattices, but we can't even manage to do NIZK. It's really unfortunate. So this was an open problem for a long time, and our main theorem is to finally close this problem. We can show NIZK proofs for any NP language, assuming the hardness of LWE, and thereby worst case lattice problems. So that's what the topic for today will be. And the route by which it's shown is very surprising compared to what I might have expected in 2008 or even in 2014 or 15. So it's a surprising route to a theorem that we had hoped for a while. And the route that we will follow starts with what's known as the Fiesta heuristic from 1986. And Fiesta and Shamir proposed a method for removing interaction from any public coin protocol. So public coin protocol is one where the verifier simply sends uniformly random challenges to the prover. It doesn't have any secret randomness. And all the protocols I've shown you so far are public coin indeed, so the Fiesta heuristic would apply to them. And the idea is that we will replace these public challenges with hash values instead. So here's kind of a picture of a generic protocol where the prover sends some message alpha, the verifier replies with some string, randomly chosen string beta, which is m bits, and then the prover answers that challenge with a message gamma. And this might go on and on for more messages, but three messages will be enough for our purposes today. So Fiesta and Shamir say, well, if you have a protocol that looks like this, then you can transform it into a non-interactive protocol on the right here, where we have a modified prover and a modified verifier, and there's some hash function which is publicly known to everybody. So you imagine putting that hash function in the common reference string or the common random string. And we can now flatten the protocol into just one message that goes from the prover to the verifier as follows. So the prover computes its first message alpha as normal, but then instead of waiting for the verifier to answer with the challenge beta, the prover instead computes beta as the hash of its first message alpha. Okay, so the prover can do that internally and just simulate the verifier's challenge this way, or set the challenge according to the hash function. And then the prover has alpha, it has the challenge beta, and so it therefore computes the reply gamma and sends all of that over to the verifier. Okay, now you don't actually have to send beta to the verifier. The verifier can receive alpha, compute beta itself, and then check whether gamma works. So this is the generic transformation which flattens the protocol in this way, and the verifier can check the proof in the same way, right? It just takes alpha, treats its own challenge as if that were hash of alpha, and then checks whether gamma works. Okay, so when you do this transformation, it turns out that completeness is very easy to. It's easy to see that completeness is preserved. If the prover can work in this interactive setting, it can certainly work in this setting as well. And it turns out that zero knowledge is also easy to preserve, or at least zero knowledge against an honest verifier is easy to preserve. For zero knowledge, basically what we would do is run the simulator for this protocol to get an alpha, beta, gamma transcript, and then we would just kind of program the hash function so that it hashes alpha to beta. And there's an easy generic way to do that programming. You just need the hash, you need to program h at one point, so that's very easy to do. Okay, so completeness and zero knowledge, these are straightforward to preserve at the same time. But the real question and the key challenge with the Fiesta-Shamir transformation is soundness. So that is, when the statement is false, why is it, or is it the case that a prover can still not cheat in this non-interactive protocol? Right? So we know it can't cheat in this protocol, but that's based on the randomness of the verifier's challenge. And here there's no actually random challenge, there's just the hash value of alpha. And so what you have to think about is whether there's any alpha and gamma with beta equals hash of alpha that would fool the verifier. So the prover in particular can just try a bunch of alphas. It can try this alpha, hash it, see if it's able to complete the protocol. If not, try again with a different alpha, hash it, see if it can complete the protocol, and so on. Right? Or it could even look at the hash value, the hash function, and try to reverse engineer some kind of alpha that has a good challenge that allows it to complete the proof. So this really the question, we don't know how to, in general, analyze this question. And moreover, do these messages exist, and can a cheating prover find such values efficiently if it has the hash function? If it knows what the hash function is, can it efficiently find them? And this is the question of, do we have a proof which is sound against an unbounded prover, or do we have an argument which is only sound against a computationally efficient prover? So these are the two questions that one has to consider when thinking about soundness of this Fiesta-Shamir protocol. Okay. Any questions about this so far? Yes. Yes, right. There are many alpha, beta, gammas which will convince the verifier. Right. I mean, the prover has its choice of what alpha to send at the beginning, and in general, there are many messages it could send at the beginning. Is there a valid? Okay, so the question, I think, is where the prover is trying to convince the verifier that a statement is in a language L. So the statement is either in the language or it's not, right? The graph has a Hamiltonian cycle or it does not. And what we would like is, when the graph does not have a Hamiltonian cycle, we would want there to not be any such alpha, beta, gamma that will convince the verifier. Or a weaker thing we could ask for is, maybe there do exist such alpha, beta, gamma, but they are hard for a cheating prover to find. So that's the difference between a proof and an argument here. We're not too concerned with extracting witnesses or anything like that in this work, at least. Any other question about this? Yeah. Right, the question is, it seems like Fiesta-Shamir could only give you an argument rather than a proof, because there might always exist alpha, beta, gamma that work here. It turns out we will be able to get a proof out of the Fiesta-Shamir heuristic if we do it properly, which is a little bit counterintuitive. I agree. It's not clear how you could imagine a proof coming out of this. Oh yes, yeah. Right. So the original protocol we imagine is a proof. It's a proof. We don't know how to do much with Fiesta-Shamir when the original protocol is an argument. So yeah, this protocol for our work will always be a proof. Right. Good question. Okay. All right. So that's the Fiesta-Shamir. Again, the key challenge is to show that it preserves soundness. And there's been a very nice line of work in the past couple of years showing cases or situations in which we can do Fiesta-Shamir soundly in a way that preserves soundness of the original protocol. So this is work by Kalai, Rothblum and Rothblum, Kennedy Chen, Rothblum and Rothblum, Holmgren and Lombardi, and all of the names I just read. So Kennedy, Chen, Holmgren, Lombardi, Rothblum, and Wicks. So this again is the picture of the Fiesta-Shamir transformed protocol. And what this line of work showed in basically a oversimplifying summary is that in many situations a correlation intractable hash family is sufficient to preserve soundness. Okay, so what does this mean? Correlation intractability was a notion defined by Kennedy, Goldrake, and Halevi in '98. And the property says that if we give the adversary a randomly chosen member of the hash family, then it should be hard or even impossible for the adversary to find an input alpha such that the pair alpha and its hash is in a certain relation. Okay, so the relation that we are interested in here, in particular, is the relation of alpha-beta pairs, which can be completed to fool the verifier. Okay, so the relation of alpha-beta pairs for which there exists a third message gamma that causes the verifier to accept. So syntactically, this is sort of just saying, it's not actually saying anything new. It's saying in order to get soundness, we need soundness. Okay? Or in order to get soundness, we need this correlation intractability. If you look at the definition of correlation intractability, it says soundness, okay, for the original proof. But it's actually a very useful concept nevertheless. Right? So given the hash function, it's hard to find an alpha where alpha and the hash can be completed to convince the verifier. Right? That's all we're asking for. But what's interesting is that this notion, so Holmgren Lombardi and then Canetti et al. Actually proved something more interesting about this, which is they gave NIZK proofs for any NP language, assuming that we have a hash family that is correlation intractable for all bounded sized circuits. Okay, so what this means is we look at, we fix a circuit C, and let's say it has size at most S, where S is some fixed polynomial. Think like n to the 10th or something like that. So what we want is the hash family to be intractable for this relation, where the relation is alpha and C of alpha. So every alpha has exactly one witness or pair, value that pairs with it, which is simply the value of the circuit at alpha. And what we want is a hash family that is correlation intractable for all such relations simultaneously. So here's why this is useful. The main idea behind our proof in 2 or 3 lines. So imagine that Hamiltonian cycle protocol that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Well, it turns out that if you think about it, and imagine running it in parallel m times. Right? So we're running this in parallel, so therefore the verifier is providing an m-bit challenge string, beta. And every alpha that the prover may send, so the initial message, which is the commitment to all the permuted graph, any such alpha that the prover sends, there is at most one bad challenge which can allow V to be fooled. Okay. So let's unpack what that means. Forget for the moment running it in parallel. Let's just look at one instance of the protocol. So one run of the protocol. We send the permuted graph, and the graph is either isomorphic to G, or well, it's a commitment to a graph which is either isomorphic to G or is not isomorphic to G. As we already argued, in either case, there is the prover will be caught with one of the 2 challenges. Okay? So there's one challenge where the prover will be caught, and there's one challenge where the prover may be able to complete the proof to convince the verifier. If we do this m times, then no matter what the prover sends in the original m-fold message at the beginning, there is exactly one string which the prover which may allow the prover to complete the proof. Okay, exactly one. If we have a different bit at any position of that string, the prover will be caught because it cannot respond to that corresponding challenge. So there's exactly one bad challenge, and it's a bad challenge. It's bad for the verifier. It's good for the cheating prover, but we'll take the verifier's side here and call this a bad challenge to say that it fools the verifier into accepting something it shouldn't accept. And here's the key point, which gets to the question that was asked before. It turns out that this bad challenge beta is efficiently computable given alpha. Well, it's efficiently computable given alpha using a trapdoor for the commitments that are in alpha. So if you remember, we committed to the edges of the of the permuted graph, and we also committed to the permutation row. And the question was, why commit to the permutation row? Well, that's because if we have a trapdoor for those commitments, we can unlock or decrypt all of those commitments. We learn all of the edges, we learn the permutation row, and we can actually see, is now that committed graph isomorphic to G or not? And so by opening all those commitments using the trapdoor, we can actually efficiently compute which of the two challenges, or which string beta, is one which could fool the verifier. So we can tell, is that committed graph actually isomorphic to G? If it's isomorphic to G, then we know that, that beta equals 0 is the bad challenge. If it's not isomorphic to G, we know that beta equals 1 is the bad challenge. We could add for each of the m copies of the protocol that we're running, and therefore compute the single bad string data. Okay, so what's the point? Well, the bad challenge is unique. It's efficiently computable with a trapdoor for the commitment scheme. But if we have a hash family which is intractable for all bounded circuits, in particular, it's intractable for the circuit which computes beta. It's intractable for the circuit which computes beta from alpha. And therefore, we know it is hard for the attacker to find an alpha such that the hash of alpha equals the bad beta. So the bad beta is a certain circuit of alpha, and it is hard to find an alpha such that the hash of alpha equals C of alpha. Okay. So this is how correlation intractability gives us a secure or sound Fiesta version of the protocol. So this is pretty challenging stuff if you've never seen it before, so I'm happy to take any questions or clarifications on this argument. It's either perfectly clear or very difficult, one or the other. Okay. Yes. R sub C is one of the relations, is a relation that this hash family is correlation intractable for. And we are interested in the circuit C, which computes the bad challenge from alpha. So what this says is that the prover, we know, cannot find an alpha such that hash of alpha equals C of alpha. Okay. But C of alpha is just the bad challenge. So in other words, we're saying the prover cannot find an alpha such that hash of alpha is the bad challenge. And because the bad challenge is unique, any other challenge, the prover cannot complete the proof. And it also can't find an alpha that hashes to the bad challenge, which would allow it to complete the proof, but it can't find such an alpha, and therefore the protocol is sound. Right, so it is sufficient to consider bounded circuits because beta is a fixed size circuit function of alpha. So we don't need unbounded size circuits, we only need bounded size circuits for the correlation intractability. And that will be important because that is all we will manage to achieve in this work. So we fix a circuit size, maybe it's n to the 10th or something like that, and then we need a hash family which is correlation intractable for that size. Yeah, so there's just some maybe large polynomial bound here on the size of the circuit. Large enough to fit the functions which map alpha to the bad challenge. All right, very good. Any other question about this here? So what we've said is if you can get correlation intractability of this kind, then you get non-interactive zero knowledge for NP. But can we obtain such correlation intractability? So one of the first papers referenced in the previous slide So CCRR showed that they can get correlation intractability for all so-called sparse relations. That's a little bit more than what we need. Sparse relations they may have many different betas for a single alpha, but the fraction of them is very small. But this, more worryingly, was based on quite exotic assumptions, like optimal exponential hardness of some ad hoc LWE problem, which we don't have much, don't have too much reason to believe in. Holmgren and Labardi showed that they can get correlation intractability again for sparse relations from a strong form of obfuscation plus other assumptions. So whether that's a better assumption or worse than the optimal hardness, I'm not sure. Most interestingly to us, Canetti et al. Showed how to get correlation intractability for all bounded circuits from FHE, so fully homomorphic encryption, which is circularly secure. So circular secure FHE is the one and only assumption they need. And this seems very close to LWE, but the circular security part is the question mark. So we don't actually know how to get circular secure FHE from plain LWE or from worst case lattice problems. So it's just an assumption that we make, and we think that such an assumption is reasonable, but we don't know how to get it from LWE. We do, however, know how to construct this from some kind of ad hoc circular secure LWE, but we don't know how to justify the circular security of LWE. So this gets very close to what we want, which is just ordinary LWE as an assumption. And that's our main construction. So we do manage to get a correlation intractable hash family, again, for all bounded circuits from the plain LWE assumption with no circular security requirements. And this holds, in fact, we only need small polynomial approximation factors on the LWE. It's worth remarking that, much like Canetti et al., our construction has what are called two different modes of intractability, and these correspond to whether you end up with a proof or an argument in your NIZK protocol. So one mode is what's called a computational mode, and it says that if you're given a hash function from the family, it's hard to find, it's intractable to find an alpha such that the hash of alpha equals C of alpha. So if you set up if you use this hash family, this computational mode for your hash family, then what we end up with is an argument system. Okay, so the hard to find part means that the prover has to be computationally bounded. An unbounded prover might be able to find this, but a bounded prover cannot. So you end up with an argument. But on the positive side, it's statistically zero knowledge. So the proof reveals nothing even to an unbounded verifier. And another advantage of this is in the random string model. So you only need a uniformly random string, not a reference string for this. So these are two nice properties to have because proofs, non-interactive proofs last forever, right? You can publish them, and then years later people can try to break their security. It's nice to have statistical zero knowledge there, and it's also nice to only need a random string, not a trusted setup. But the other mode, if you really want a proof, we do have a way of obtaining proofs, and this is done via the statistical mode of the hash family. So what this says is, if you choose a hash function from the family, from a certain family which is indistinguishable from our family, then there simply do not exist any alpha such that h of alpha equals c of alpha. So that means there is just no proof at all of a false statement. And even a prover who works forever cannot find such a proof. So that gives you a zero knowledge proof. As you might expect, it's computationally zero knowledge, so that flips the notion of security from a unbounded verifier to a bounded verifier. And it also requires a reference string, so there needs to be a trusted setup. The string itself is structured. So that's kind of the main technical contribution in a few lines from the work of what we actually build, and then plugging it into the theorem from Canetti et al., we get the NICK protocol. All right, so any question about this so far?